Hello, Hedge. Recently, I came across a very interesting story involving secret agents. I believe it will be interesting to you. It all started on an unremarkable Tuesday in January. I remember because it was one of those winter days where the sun pretends to come out but doesn't provide any warmth. I was heading back from my part-time job at the construction site. Covered in dust and sweat despite the cold, I just wanted to get home, grab a quick shower, and dive into my architectural design assignments. Life was simple back then: work, study, sleep, repeat. I was crossing the intersection near Hanover and Elm when I saw an old lady. She was a tiny woman, maybe about 5 feet 2 inches, with a thick scarf wrapped around her head and a shopping bag that looked heavier than she could manage. She hesitated at the curb, looking at the passing cars with the kind of nervous energy that made you want to hold your breath for her. I almost walked past her, almost. Something about the way she shifted from foot to foot got to me. So, I stopped. "Do you need help crossing the street, ma'am?" I asked, realizing that my voice came out louder than I intended. She squinted at me like she was trying to read my face. "Oh, thank you, dear," she said, her voice soft but firm. "That would be very kind of you." Her name was Helen. At least, that's what she told me when I asked as we shuffled across the icy road together. Her hands trembled slightly, and she leaned on my arm more than I expected. Once we got to the other side, I thought I was done, but she gestured to a nearby building. "I live just over there. Would you mind carrying this for me? My arthritis has been acting up." I hesitated. The bag looked like it was filled with bricks, but I wasn't going to say no. The building she pointed to was one of those old brownstones with chipped paint and an air of faded grandeur. The kind of place where you could imagine a quirky sitcom character living. We climbed 3 flights of creaky stairs, the bag digging into my fingers. She unlocked her door, a bright blue one with a cheerful wreath, oddly out of place in the otherwise drab hallway, and thanked me profusely before disappearing inside. I thought that would be it, just a one-off moment of goodwill. But over the next few weeks, I started running into Helen everywhere. At the corner store, struggling with bags again. Near the bus stop, trying to wave down a cab. Once, I spotted her standing outside her building, wrestling with an umbrella in the wind. Each time, she'd smile like she hadn't seen me in years and say something like, "Oh, my lucky star, it's you again." The first time I truly got to know the old lady, it was during a snowstorm. The city had been blanketed in white since morning, and the streets were slushy and treacherous. My boots were soaked from trudging back home after a long day, the kind where every muscle aches. I rounded the corner near Hanover Avenue, my breath fogging in the cold air, when I saw her again. She was standing near a bus stop that hadn't seen a bus in hours, her gloved hands clutching the same bag of groceries I'd carried for her once before. She looked small, almost swallowed by the scarf wrapped around her head and shoulders. Her face was pale, lined, and sharp, with piercing gray eyes that seemed out of place on someone her age. Despite the harsh weather, there was something composed about her, like the storm around her was a minor inconvenience. "Looks like we meet again," I said, trying to sound casual as I approached. My voice startled her, and she turned sharply, her eyes softening when she recognized me. "Oh, it's you, my guardian angel," she said, her lips curling into a faint smile. Her voice carried a certain poise, like someone who had been in charge of important things once upon a time. I laughed. "I wouldn't go that far. You look like you need a hand, though." Before she could argue, I took the bag from her. It was heavy as always. She gestured down the block, toward her building. "I didn't think the storm would get this bad," she admitted. "I'm Helen, by the way. You probably think of me as the old lady with groceries." I shook my head. "I'm Zeke. And yeah, you've kind of become a regular part of my day." As we trudged through the snow, she told me little things about herself. She was 60, lived alone in that same old brownstone, and didn't have family nearby. When I asked if she had kids, she waved the question off with a vague, life had other plans. She'd worked in business, whatever that meant, and retired early, though she didn't elaborate. The brownstone itself was a piece of history, the kind of building you'd expect to find in an old detective novel. The bricks were worn and uneven, with ivy creeping up one side. The inside was no less intriguing. Creaky wooden stairs that groaned under every step, a faint smell of lavender and dust, and walls lined with faded wallpaper that probably hadn't been updated in decades. Her apartment was small, but cozy. A threadbare rug covered the wooden floor, and the furniture looked like it had been around since the 70s. The room was dominated by a large bookshelf crammed with old leather-bound books and a few framed photographs. One picture caught my eye, the young woman standing in front of what looked like the Eiffel Tower, her expression confident and distant. "That's me," she said, noticing my gaze. Her tone was wistful, but firm. "Paris a lifetime ago." I nodded, unsure what to say. There was something about her, an air of mystery, like she carried stories she'd never tell. Before I left that day, she pressed a small cup of tea into my hands. "Thank you, Jake. The world needs more young men like you," she said with a warmth that felt almost motherly. I walked home that night with more questions than answers. The image of the old lady in her strange little apartment etched in my mind. Something about her felt different, like she was more than just another lonely neighbor in a city full of lonely neighbors. An unlikely bond. Over the next few weeks, helping the old lady, Helen, became part of my routine. It wasn't planned. I just run into her more often than seemed normal. At first, it was always the same scenario. Groceries too heavy to carry, a crossing she couldn't manage, or a stubborn lock on her apartment door that refused to budge. But then it started to shift. One evening, as I was leaving her place after carrying her shopping bags up those rickety stairs, she invited me to stay for tea. "It's the least I can do," she said, motioning toward the mismatched chairs around a small, round table in her kitchen. The kitchen was like stepping back in time. Yellowed cabinets with peeling paint lined the walls, and an old stove hummed quietly in the corner. There was a faint aroma of chamomile and cinnamon in the air, and the window above the sink rattled faintly in the wind. A small radio sat on the counter, playing classical music at a low volume. Helen herself seemed different in her own space. She shed the frailty she often showed on the street, moving with a quiet confidence as she poured tea into chipped china cups. She even laughed, a dry, almost sarcastic laugh, as she told me about her adventures of the day. "What kind of adventures?" I asked, curious. "Oh, nothing thrilling," she said, waving a hand. "A standoff with the cashier at the market who tried to overcharge me, and a battle with my heater, which insists on making life difficult." We talked for hours that night. I told her about my life, how I was working on construction sites during the day and studying architecture at night, how I wanted to design buildings that people actually wanted to live in, not just cookie-cutter high-rises. She listened intently, her gray eyes sharp and focused. "You're a dreamer," she said eventually. "That's good. The world could use more dreamers." "And you?" I asked. "What did you dream about when you were my age?" She hesitated, her expression unreadable. "Ah, Jake," she said after a long pause, "some dreams aren't meant to come true." As winter turned to spring, I saw Helen more and more. Sometimes she'd call me from her window as I walked by, waving a handkerchief like a scene out of an old movie. Other times, she just happened to be out on the sidewalk when I was passing, as if waiting for me. She started to feel like an odd sort of friend. She'd ask me about my designs, and I'd sketch things out on a napkin for her, while she critiqued them with a surprising amount of insight. "You need to think about how the light will hit this corner," she said once, pointing to a rough drawing of a small house. "No one wants to live in shadows, Jake." Her advice was always practical, never sentimental. It was clear she was sharp, maybe even sharper than I was. But there was a heaviness to her, a kind of weight that hung in the air when she spoke about herself. I asked her once about her past, why she didn't have anyone around. She brushed it off. "I've had a full life," she said simply. "But some chapters are better left closed." One day, as we sat on the stoop outside her building, watching the neighborhood go about its business, Helen turned to me with a question I wasn't expecting. "Why do you keep helping me?" she asked, her tone light, but her eyes serious. I shrugged. "You look like you need it." She laughed, that dry, sarcastic laugh I'd grown used to. "You're too kind for your own good, Jake. People like you, they get used. You should learn to say no once in a while." "Maybe," I admitted, "but not to you." She didn't reply, just sipped her tea and looked out at the street. For a moment, she looked sad, I couldn't figure out why, and I didn't press her. Looking back, maybe I should have. By late spring, the old lady had become a fixture in my life. Our interactions felt almost choreographed, like the city itself conspired to place her in my path. I started carrying extra cash in case she needed something, or leaving work a little earlier, knowing I might end up helping her with another errand. But then, one day, she wasn't there. I didn't think much of it at first. People have lives, even people like Helen, who seem glued to their routines. Maybe she was visiting someone, or maybe she'd finally called a service to help with her groceries. The second day, though, I felt a small knot of worry form in my chest. By the fifth day, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The stoop outside her brownstone was empty, her windows shut tight. There was no familiar handkerchief waving at me, no chance encounters on the street. I decided to check on her. The building felt eerily quiet as I climbed the stairs. Each creak of the wood echoed loudly in the dim hallway. When I reached her bright blue door, I knocked lightly at first, then louder. No answer. I tried the neighbors. The first was a middle-aged man in a stained undershirt who barely opened his door. The old lady? Haven't seen her in a while, he said before shutting it in my face. The next neighbor, a woman with curlers in her hair, was more talkative but just as unhelpful. She keeps to herself, that one, real quiet. Hope she's okay. By the time I got to the end of the hall, I was feeling uneasy. Helen didn't seem like the type to just disappear. That night, I walked by her building twice, hoping to see her light on or catch her coming home. Nothing. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. A month passed, and life swept me up again. Between my construction job and finals for architecture school, I barely had time to think. But every now and then, I'd pass her building and glance at her window, half expecting to see her silhouette. The unease lingered, but I convinced myself she'd moved away, or maybe she'd gone to stay with someone. Then, on a sweltering June afternoon, everything changed. I was walking home, my backpack slung over one shoulder and my head full of half-formed design ideas, when a man in a sharp black suit stepped out of nowhere and blocked my path. "Jacob Miller?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. I blinked at him, confused. He was in his late 30s with a neatly trimmed beard and sunglasses that reflected my startled expression back at me. Yeah, that's me," I said cautiously. "I need you to come with me," he said, gesturing to a nearby alley. Alarm bells went off in my head. "Who are you? What's this about?" "I'm Agent Carter, FBI," he said, flashing a badge so quickly I barely had time to read it. "This isn't a request." Two more men appeared from behind a parked car. Before I could react, one of them grabbed my arm and snapped a pair of handcuffs around my wrist. "Hey, what the hell is going on?" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. "You're under investigation," Carter said, his tone neutral. "You'll get answers soon enough. Let's go." I was shoved into an unmarked car and driven through the city. The ride was silent except for the sound of my breathing, which was getting faster with every turn we took. When we arrived at the FBI field office, I was escorted inside like some kind of high-value criminal. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as I was led to an interrogation room, a small, gray box with a metal table and two chairs. Carter sat across from me, placing a thick folder on the table. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he stared at me, his expression unreadable. "Jacob Miller," he began, his tone measured. "For the past year, you've been in contact with a highly classified operative of a foreign state. We have reason to believe you've been assisting her." I blinked, stunned. "What? Are you serious? What are you even talking about?" He leaned forward, tapping the folder. "The woman you know as Helen." The room seemed to tilt for a moment. "You think Helen is what, a spy?" Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. "We don't think. We know." I laughed, though it came out hollow. "You've got the wrong guy. I just helped her with groceries. She's an old lady, for God's sake." "She's not who you think she is," Carter said coldly. "And you might not be, either." I spent the rest of that day in a cell. It was small and cold, with nothing but a metal bench and a toilet in the corner. The walls seemed to close in on me as my mind raced. Helen a spy? The idea was absurd. How could a frail old lady who struggled with grocery bags and arthritis be some kind of secret agent? The hours dragged on. I replayed every interaction I'd had with her in my mind, looking for signs I might have missed. But all I could think about were her dry laughs, her cryptic comments, and that picture of her in front of the Eiffel Tower. When the door finally opened, it wasn't Carter or any of the other agents I'd seen before. It was a man in his 50s with a weathered face and sharp blue eyes. He wore a simple black suit, and there was something about his posture that screamed authority. "Mr. Miller," he said in a low voice, glancing down at a clipboard. "We need to have another conversation." I groaned. "At 3 in the morning? Seriously?" But he didn't respond, just gestured for me to follow. 2 guards flanked me as I was led out of the cell and down a narrow hallway. The building was eerily quiet, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the walls. We exited through a side door into an alley where a black van was waiting. The man opened the back door and motioned for me to get in. "Where are we going?" I demanded, my voice shaky. "Somewhere we can talk," he said. The van drove in silence for what felt like an eternity. The city blurred past the tinted windows, the neon lights of late-night diners and gas stations reflecting off the glass. Finally, we pulled up to a spot near the river. It wasn't the middle of nowhere, but it felt close enough. A park stretched along the waterfront, its walking paths empty in the dead of night. "Out!" the man ordered. I climbed out of the van, shivering slightly in the cool night air. The agent leaned against the hood, watching me with an inscrutable expression. "We're waiting," he said simply. "Waiting for what?" I asked, but he didn't answer. For the next hour, we stood in silence. The only sound the faint ripple of water and the occasional hum of a passing car. My nerves were shot, my mind conjuring every possible worst-case scenario. And then, at exactly 4:10 a.m., a sleek black Mustang rolled into view. It came to a stop a few feet away, and the driver's side window rolled down. My jaw dropped. It was Helen. She looked nothing like the frail old lady I'd spent the past year helping. Her hair, usually hidden under a scarf, was tied back neatly, and she wore a tailored black jacket that made her look impossibly sharp. Her gray eyes, which had always seemed soft and kind, were now cold and calculating. "Good to see you again, Jake," she said, her voice steady. I stumbled over my words. What the hell is going on?" She reached into the car and pulled out a thick envelope, tossing it onto the pavement at my feet. "Your payment. $22,000. For your help." "Help with what?" I shouted, anger and confusion boiling over. "I didn't do anything except carry your groceries and hold doors for you." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sometimes, Jake, that's all it takes. You're a good man. Too good. And I'm sorry you got dragged into this." The man who had escorted me to the river cleared his throat. "We're done here," he said, as if dismissing me. Helen nodded at him, then looked back at me. "Take the money, Jake, and forget you ever knew me." Before I could respond, she rolled up the window and sped off into the night. I stood there, the envelope in my hand, my mind spinning. The agent who had brought me there said nothing, just motioned for me to get back in the van. I wasn't taken back to the FBI field office. Instead, they dropped me off a block from my apartment as dawn began to break. I never saw Helen again. Life after that night felt surreal. For the first few days, I half expected black SUVs to follow me or agents to show up at my door. Every knock or unexpected sound made my heart race. But nothing happened. The envelope sat on my desk, unopened. I didn't want to touch it, but I also couldn't bring myself to throw it away. $20,000 could solve a lot of problems, a semester of tuition, rent, maybe even a new laptop to replace the ancient brick I was using for my architecture work. But every time I looked at it, I felt sick. A week later, I decided to go back to Helen's building. Her window was still dark, and the blue door to her apartment was locked. I knocked anyway, half hoping she'd answer. Instead, one of the neighbors, the woman with curlers in her hair, peeked out into the hallway. "Looking for her again?" she asked. I nodded. "Yeah. Do you know what happened to her?" She shook her head. "No one does. One day she was here, the next day she wasn't. The landlord's been through her place though. Clean it out real quick." "Odd, don't you think?" My stomach twisted. "Yeah. Well, the landlord wasn't much help either. He claimed he didn't know where Helen had gone and seemed more interested in getting me off the property than answering questions. Old tenants come and go, he grumbled. What's it to you? I left feeling more frustrated than ever. Every thread I pulled just unraveled into nothing. By the end of the month, I'd resigned myself to the fact that I'd never get answers. Helen, if that was even her real name, was gone, and with her the strange chapter of my life. I threw myself into work and school, trying to move on, but the whole ordeal stayed with me, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. The only evidence it ever happened was the envelope of cash. One night, after a particularly brutal shift on the construction site, I finally gave in. I opened it. The money was there, crisp and neatly stacked, just as she'd promised. But tucked between the bills was something else, a folded piece of paper. It was a note, written in perfect, flowing cursive. Asterisk, Jake, I'm sorry for the trouble I caused you. You're a good man, and you didn't deserve this. Please accept this as my thanks and my apology. You may never know the full story, but trust that your kindness mattered more than you'll ever realize. Helen, I read the note a dozen times, hoping it would reveal something more. But it didn't. Years later, I still think about her. About the strange, sharp-eyed woman who seemed to appear out of nowhere and disappear just as suddenly. About the life she must have led and the secret she carried. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if she's still out there, pulling the strings of some larger game I'll never understand. Other times, I think about her warning that people like me get used, and I wonder if she was right. But most of all, I think about the last thing she wrote in that note. Your kindness mattered. Maybe that's all I need to know. Thanks for reading, everyone. I don't know if this story makes me a fool or just unlucky, but it stayed with me all these years, and I thought it was finally time to share it. Let me know if you've ever had something like this happen, something that felt bigger than you, with answers you'll never get.